Rowan Ellis lived a life most people wouldn't notice at first glance. She was quiet, disciplined, and independent, the type who preferred to work in silence and let her results speak for themselves. What no one in her family knew was that she had built an incredible fortune through smart real estate investments and careful saving. Over the years, her properties grew in value, and with every deal she made, her financial future became more secure. By the time she was ready to look back, her hidden wealth had reached $8 million. It hadn't come easily. She had left home at 18 with nothing but determination. Long hours at different jobs and nights spent studying taught her resilience. Every dollar she earned was stretched, saved, or invested. She refused to waste her efforts, and slowly, brick by brick, she built the life she wanted. Her family had no idea. They always thought of her as the serious one, too distant and difficult to ever make something of herself. Compared to her younger sister, who was showered with affection and praise, Rowan was overlooked, dismissed as the one who never quite fit the family's image of success. In their eyes, she was the afterthought, the one left behind. Rowan understood her family's nature better than they realized. She had seen their hunger for money, their tendency to grab at anything that might benefit them. It was exactly why she chose to keep her fortune hidden. To them, she was still the quiet daughter who never asked for anything. She allowed them to think she was barely managing, because that illusion protected her from their. What she built was hers alone, the result of sacrifice, patience, and sharp decision. She guarded it carefully, not because she didn't know how to share, but because she knew the people closest to her would never see her efforts for what they truly were. To them, it would only be an opportunity to take. In silence, Rowan carried her secret, watching her family from a distance. She didn't need their approval anymore. What mattered was that she had created her own future, one that no one could take from her. At least, not until the day her carefully hidden truth was dragged into the open. Rowan grew up in a home where love and attention were never shared equally. Her parents, Martha and Douglas, always looked at her younger sister with admiration and warmth. Celeste was treated like a treasure, praised for the smallest things, spoiled with gifts, and constantly reminded of how special she was. Rowan, on the other hand, was met with criticism. If she spoke her mind, she was told she was too serious. If she kept quiet, she was called difficult. Nothing she did seemed enough to earn the same affection. The gap between the two sisters grew wider as the years went on. At family dinners, Celeste was the star, filling the room with stories and laughter while her parents hung on every word. Rowan would sit quietly, knowing her efforts would go unnoticed. If she mentioned her grades or achievements, the conversation was brushed aside or turned back to Celeste. It was clear who the favorite was, and Rowan felt the sting of it every day. By the time she was 18, the weight of it all became too heavy. One night, after another fight where her parents compared her to her sister, Rowan snapped. Words she had held in for years poured out, raw and sharp. She told them she was done trying, done fighting for love that would never come. With anger still burning in her chest, she packed her things and walked out, promising herself she would never depend on them again. Life outside her parents' house was harsh, but it was hers. Rowan worked wherever she could, waiting tables, stocking shelves, cleaning offices late at night. She refused to complain, even when exhaustion made her body ache. She enrolled in classes, often staying up until dawn to study after long shifts. Every dollar she earned was carefully set aside. She learned to live with less so she could build more for the future. Over time, she discovered real estate. It wasn't glamorous in the beginning, just small properties that others overlooked. She saw potential where others saw risk, and slowly her decisions began to pay off. Each step forward came from her own hands, her own vision, and her own discipline. Back at home, her family carried on with their assumptions. To them, Rowan was still the one who had barely gotten by, the serious daughter who never had much. When they spoke of her, it was often with pity, as if she were someone who needed saving. Behind closed doors, they shook their heads, wondering why she couldn't be more like Celeste, who seemed to shine effortlessly. What they didn't know was that Rowan had already proven herself, not to them but to herself. She had turned her pain into drive, her solitude into strength. While they pitied her, she was quietly building a life that would one day reveal just how wrong they had been. Her decision to attend the family gathering was filled with hesitation. Rowan knew how these evenings usually went, with her sitting quietly while everyone else praised Celeste. Still, she forced herself to go, hoping to keep the peace. She kept her distance, speaking little, and stayed cautious about revealing anything personal. Her sister, however, couldn't resist prying. While Rowan was distracted, Celeste slipped into her thing. She had always been nosy, but this time she found something she was never meant to see. Tucked away inside Rowan's bag were papers tied to her real estate holding. At first glance, it looked ordinary, but the numbers told a different story. Celeste's eyes lit up as she realized her sister wasn't just managing. She was wealthy, unbelievably. Dinner began the same as always, with attention focused on Celeste. Rowan ate quietly, used to being overlooked. But Celeste was restless, her discovery too big to keep to herself. With a sudden burst, she blurted out, "Rowan's worth $8 million. The table froze. Every conversation stopped, and the room fell into stunned silence. Martha and Douglas stared at their older daughter, as if seeing her for the first time. Moments later, their shock melted into smiles that felt forced and sugary. The cold, dismissive tone they usually used on her was replaced with exaggerated warmth, as if they had always cared. Rowan sat frozen, her stomach sinking. The secret she had guarded for years was no longer hers. She felt exposed, her privacy ripped away in front of the very people she had kept it from. The worst part was not the money being revealed. It was that her own sister had done it, smiling as though betrayal was just another joke at the table. The trust she had once held, fragile as it was, shattered in an instant. Later that night, Rowan tried to slip away quietly, but her parents blocked her path. Their faces no longer carried the sweetness they had shown at dinner. Instead, their eyes were sharp with expectation. Douglas crossed his arms and spoke first. His voice was firm, almost scolding. He told Rowan that everything she had came from them. He reminded her of the roof over her head when she was younger, the food she ate, the clothes she wore. To him, that meant she owed them. "The least you can do," he said, "is give back a couple million." Before Rowan could answer, Celeste jumped in, eager to add her opinion. She tilted her head and smirked. "Why should you keep all that money when you don't even have kids or a family to spend it on? It makes no sense. You don't need it the way we do." Her words stung, not just because of the greed behind them, but because she spoke as if Rowan's choices and sacrifices meant nothing at all. Rowan took a breath and tried to explain. She told them how long she had worked, how much she had given up, how many nights she went without sleep to reach where she was. She tried to make them see that none of it had been easy, but her words fell flat. Martha waved her hand and called it luck, as if years of discipline and risk-taking could be dismissed with a single word. Douglas nodded in agreement, saying that anyone could have stumbled into the same fortune if they were at the right place at the right time. The more Rowan spoke, the more it became clear that they had no interest in her story. They weren't listening. Their minds were fixed on what they believed was there. Finally, Douglas leaned closer, his tone leaving no room for discussion. He demanded that Rowan hand over $2 million immediately. Martha backed him, calling it her duty as a daughter. Celeste smiled, pleased to see the pressure mounting. In that moment, Rowan felt the walls close in around her. The family who had dismissed her for years now stood united in their grief, twisting her success into something she owed them. Their demands weren't requests. They were orders, dressed up as entitlement and obligation. She realized no amount of explaining would change how they saw her. To them, she wasn't a person who had struggled and built a life. She was a bank, and they wanted their withdrawal. The conversation did not stop with demands. When Rowan tried to excuse herself, her parents followed her into the hallway. Their voices softened, but the words carried a heavy weight. Martha looked at her with watery eyes and said, "You abandoned us after everything we did for you. Don't you think you owe us?" Douglas echoed her, shaking his head as if her refusal to give them money was the ultimate betrayal. The guilt pressed down on Rowan, but she stayed silent, unwilling to let their words sink too deep. Before she could even form a reply, Celeste jumped in with her usual confidence. She crossed her arms and declared that she also deserved something. She claimed she had always been the one holding the family together, the one who kept peace between their parents and Rowan. "If anyone has earned a share, it's me," she said boldly, her eyes shining with entitlement. Her words made Rowan's stomach twist. It was shameless, spoken as though years of favoritism and comfort somehow counted as sacrifice. The more Rowan listened, the clearer everything became. The masks her family wore had slipped. They were not approaching her out of love, concern, or fairness. They wanted her money and nothing else. Every sentence they spoke circled back to what they thought they deserved. It wasn't gratitude for her success, nor pride in what she had achieved. It was hunger, pure and simple, dressed up in the language of family duty. Her attempts to reason with them only deepened her anger. When she tried to explain that her wealth came from years of sacrifice, they waved it off as though it were meaningless. Martha reminded her of the past again, painting herself as the selfless mother who had given Rowan everything she needed. Douglas leaned closer, repeating that a good daughter wouldn't turn her back on her family. Celeste smirked, enjoying the scene, as though she had already won. Standing there, surrounded by the people who were supposed to care for her, Rowan felt something shift inside her. For years, she had hoped they might one day see her differently, not as the difficult child, but as a person worthy of respect. That hope vanished in an instant. Their true faces were in front of her now, selfish, greedy, and utterly ungrateful. The air felt suffocating. The house that was filled with laughter earlier in the evening now felt like a trap. Rowan could not bear another second of their manipulation. She picked up her things, ignoring the protests that followed, and walked straight to the door. Her parents called after her, their voices dripping with false hurt. Celeste shouted one last remark about how unfair Rowan was being. None of it mattered anymore. Rowan stepped into the night with her chest burning. The anger inside her was sharp and hot, but beneath it was a cold realization. To them, she would never be a daughter, a sister, or even a person. She was a wallet, nothing more. And now that she had seen it clearly, she knew she could never look at them the same way again. Rowan spent the next morning in silence, her mind replaying every word from the night before. Their voices still echoed, accusations, demands, guilt, and entitlement. It was all tangled together in her memory, and the more she thought about it, the more her anger sharpened into determination. She knew her family now for what they really were. She also knew they would not stop. If she gave them a single cent, they would come back again and again, draining her until nothing was left. She had one clear choice: protect everything she had built. That same afternoon, she arranged a meeting with the only person she trusted with her future, Grant Whitaker, her attorney. Grant had worked with her for years, handling the complicated parts of her real estate deal. He understood her careful nature, her need to keep everything in order. When she walked into his office, his expression changed as soon as he saw her face. He could tell something serious had happened. She explained what her family had discovered and how quickly they had turned against her. Grant listened without interrupting, taking notes, his brow furrowed. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and told her exactly what she needed to hear. "We'll make sure they can't touch a single dollar." Together, they went through every part of her portfolio, reviewing titles, contracts, and accounts. By the end of the week, her wealth was locked behind walls of legal protection. Trusts were established with conditions that no outsider could break. Contracts were rewritten with clauses that shielded her from anyone trying to lay claim. Rowan signed every paper with steady hands, knowing each signature was a shield against the people who once called themselves her family. But as the dust settled, another thought began to grow. Simply protecting her fortune wasn't enough. If she walked away quietly, her family would paint her as the villain. They would twist the story to make themselves the victims, whispering lies to anyone who would listen. Rowan had been underestimated her whole life, but this time she refused to let them walk away unscathed. She wanted them to feel the sting of their own greed, not just for the betrayal they had shown, but for every year they had dismissed her, every moment they had treated her as less. Revenge wasn't her first nature, but now it burned inside her like a steady flame. The idea came to her as she reviewed some old records. Among her properties was one she no longer cared for, a building that looked appealing on the surface but carried more risk than reward. Most investors would avoid it if they knew the detail. Rowan, however, saw it as the perfect stage for her plan. She began designing what looked like a golden opportunity. It would appear safe, promising, and exactly the kind of thing her parents and sister would leap at. She would play her role carefully, offering it with just enough reluctance to make them desperate. By the time they reached for it, their greed would already be the trap. The invitation came in the form of a short, carefully worded message. It spoke of meeting to negotiate a fair share, nothing more. The words were plain, but behind them was a spark of promise. That was enough to draw the attention it was meant to catch. Excitement spread quickly, and plans were already forming before the meeting even began. When the day arrived, the mood was almost festive. Smiles, eager whispers, and a glimmer of triumph filled the room. Each one of them seemed certain that a reward was finally within reach. Their chatter spilled over one another, talk of purchases, new beginnings, and comfort they believed was now theirs for the taking. On the table rested a folder, neat and heavy with papers. It wasn't pushed forward immediately. Instead, it sat there as if waiting for the right moment. When it was finally opened, photographs and figures came into view, images of a commercial property, numbers lined in clean columns. The presentation carried weight, and it drew every eye. "This is one of my older holdings," the explanation began, spoken slowly, almost as if unsure whether to share it. "It has potential, but it carries work and risk. I'm not certain it's the right choice for anyone else." The hesitation only fed their hunger. Eyes widened, hands fidgeted, voices rose with excitement. Questions came quickly. What could it bring in? How soon would it pay? How much was needed to be part of it? The eagerness was impossible to hide. Caution was offered again. "Perhaps it's better if I keep this to myself. The risks may outweigh the reward." The words were carefully placed, like a wall that was never meant to hold. The reaction was immediate. "No, this is perfect," Douglas insisted, leaning closer, his tone almost pleading. Martha followed, her voice sweetened with insistence, saying the family deserved to share in this chance. Celeste's grin was broad, her words bold as she announced that they were ready to commit without delay. The longer the silence stretched after their pleas, the more desperate they became. Ideas spilled out in half-whispers. Arguments broke out over how much each could contribute, and numbers were thrown into the air. The room pulsed with their excitement, as if the future was already theirs. Every gesture of reluctance only fueled them more. Every pause made them cling tighter to the possibility. By the end, they weren't just willing, they were begging, voices rising with urgency, their eyes fixed on what they believed was their golden chance. What they saw as opportunity was nothing more than bait. The more they reached for it, the deeper they sank into their own greed. The stage was set, and without realizing, they had placed themselves exactly where they were meant to be. The papers were signed quickly, almost too quickly. Martha and Douglas wasted no time, emptying their accounts and gathering every bit of money they had saved for years. What was once meant for security and comfort in old age was now funneled into the new deal. They convinced themselves it was not a gamble, but a brilliant step forward. Celeste went even further. Without hesitation, she reached into the joint account she shared with her husband. The balance shrank in a single stroke, and she smiled as though it were her finest achievement. There was no thought of caution, no pause to consider the risks. All she could see was the promise of quick reward, the glitter of wealth she believed should have always been hers. In the weeks that followed, pride filled their voices. They spoke openly about how clever they had been. At family gatherings and among friends, they repeated the story of how they had finally outsmarted Rowan, how they had positioned themselves to share in her success. To them, it was proof they were just as capable, just as deserving. Their laughter was loud, their words dripping with satisfaction. "We've made the smartest move of our lives," Douglas said more than once, his chest puffed with pride. Martha echoed him, certain they had secured their future. Celeste boasted that she was finally stepping into the role she was meant for, a successful investor, just like her sister. They celebrated as if the wealth were already in their pockets. But time has a way of revealing the truth. Months passed, and the shine of their decision began to fade. Bills arrived, payments dragged on, and whispers about the property started to spread. What seemed solid at first began to show cracks. The building they had poured their money into was no longer theirs to claim. It had already been sold, long before they ever reached for it. Their papers held no value, and the figures they had admired so eagerly were nothing more than words on a page. The realization came slowly, then all at once. Savings were gone. Retirement funds had vanished. Celeste's account, once shared with her husband, was stripped bare. What they thought was their triumph became their downfall, leaving them with nothing but regret. The truth was undeniable. There had been no trick, no false promise. Rowan had not lied. She had never once told them the deal was safe, never once guaranteed success. They had seen what they wanted to see, blinded by their own greed. The warnings, the hesitation, the pauses in her voice, all ignored because they were too eager to claim what they believed they deserved. Their pride, once loud, fell silent. The boasts disappeared, replaced with the weight of loss. What was supposed to lift them higher had instead dragged them down. And the more they thought about it, the clearer it became. They had not been outsmarted by Rowan. They had outsmarted themselves. The first crack appeared in Celeste's life. Her husband had grown suspicious when bills piled up and their account balance no longer matched what it should. At first, she tried to cover it up with excuses, saying she had moved money around or paid for household needs. But the truth could not stay hidden. He looked deeper, finding the transfers and the exact amount she had taken. The betrayal cut him sharply. It wasn't just the money, it was the secrecy, the greed, and the selfishness. One evening, after another bitter argument, he packed his bags and left her behind. Celeste was stunned, left with nothing but silence in the house she once filled with her laughter. At the same time, Martha and Douglas were facing problems of their own. Their savings were gone, and without that cushion, the weight of their expenses became too heavy. Notices began arriving in the mail, warning them about missed payments. They tried to stall, hoping to recover somehow, but each month dragged them further down. Eventually, the word foreclosure appeared in black letters that made their hearts sink. The home they had lived in for decades, the place they had always considered secure, was no longer safe. Fear and desperation pushed them to a decision they once would have never imagined. They picked up the phone and called Rowan. Their voices trembled, no longer demanding but pleading. They spoke through tears, saying they had lost everything. They begged her to help them, to give them just enough to rebuild. Their words were soft now, full of regret, but Rowan heard them for what they were. Another attempt to pull her back into the role of provider. She listened without interrupting. The years of dismissal, the manipulation, the pressure, they all flashed in her mind. The memory of their demands was still sharp, especially the way they once insisted she owed them a cut. When the call went quiet, she finally answered. Her voice was calm, almost icy. "You demanded your cut," she said. "You got it." There was nothing more to discuss. She ended the call and blocked their numbers, cutting the line that tied her to them once and for all. For the first time, there was no weight pressing on her shoulders, no guilt gnawing at her chest. She had given them exactly what they wanted, and it had destroyed them. Karma had arrived swiftly, without her lifting a finger. Their greed had led them down this path, and their downfall was the result of their own choices. Rowan walked away with her peace intact, leaving behind a family that had never seen her as anything more than a source of money. Now they were gone from her life, and she intended to keep it that way. The quiet after everything was almost strange. For years, Rowan had carried the weight of her family's opinions, their cold words, and their endless comparisons. Deep down, she had once hoped for their love. She had wanted their approval, a sign that she mattered to them as more than the shadow beside Celeste. But now, looking back, she saw the truth with clear eyes. Their affection had always been conditional, their respect tied only to what they could take from her. They never valued her for who she was, only for what she could provide. With that realization came a sense of release. She no longer needed their approval or their presence in her life. The pain of being overlooked had turned into strength, and the betrayal that once burned now served as a reminder of her own resilience. She was not the abandoned child they had painted her to be. She was a woman who had built her life through discipline and sacrifice, and nothing could take that from her. Instead of the family who had drained her spirit, she chose to surround herself with people who cared without hidden motives. Loyal friends stood by her side, not for her wealth, but for the person she was. Mentors who had guided her in her career remained her allies, offering advice and encouragement. Slowly, Rowan built a circle that felt more like family than the one she was born into. These were people who celebrated her successes honestly, who listened when she spoke, and who stood by her without expecting payment in return. Her days grew lighter as she leaned into this new life. Dinners with friends replaced tense family gatherings. Conversations filled with laughter and warmth left no room for guilt or manipulation. For the first time, she felt free, not just financially but emotionally. The chains that had tied her to her parents' demands and Celeste's envy were broken for good. One evening, she stood outside one of her properties, watching the sun dip below the skyline. The world around her was quiet, calm, and steady, just as she had made it. Behind her, the family she once longed for was crumbling under the very greed that had driven them. Celeste was left alone, her husband gone. Martha and Douglas had lost the home they clung to. Their downfall was not her doing. It was their own choices catching up to them. Rowan walked forward, her steps steady and unhurried. The road ahead was hers alone, free from their shadows. She carried no guilt, only clarity. The lesson was simple. Love that comes with strings is not love at all, and greed always consumes those who feed it. True karma doesn't announce itself or seek applause. It doesn't need witnesses or crowds to cheer. It works quietly, letting greed eat the greedy alive. And as Rowan moved on with her life, she knew she would never look back.